Okay, good evening, everyone. I suppose it's evening. If you're not from this part of the world, then, in whatever time of day that is, I wish you good greetings as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, this evening with the Oxford Public Philosophy Group, and for wanting to, I know it's week 8, and that's the end of term for some of us, and for having this conversation that we're gonna have in a few moments time. Tonight we are actually very honored to have Dr. Humeira Iqtidar from King's College London. um, Dr. Humeira is of course a very erudite scholar, and we are really blessed to have her with us today. So a bit of introduction to what Humeira does. Her research interests brings together postcolonial theory and comparative political theory, focusing on modern South Asian Islamic thought. Thematically, her research is concerned with the place of religion in contemporary political imagination, the politics of knowledge, and the legacies of colonialism. She is currently working on 2 book projects. The first focuses on non-liberal conceptions of tolerance through an engagement with 20th century Islamic thought. And the second is titled Justice Beyond Rights, builds on her research with refugees and migrants from tribal areas of Pakistan. And I'm pretty sure all of us have more questions for her. And if you have not seen, there are some recommended readings on the Facebook events page, and I think you can download at least one of those papers. I would highly encourage you to read it. If you haven't read it, and if you haven't, I mean, you're still welcome here. So just please feel free to ask any question you want. So without further ado, let us, I'll pass the time to Humaira, and we look forward to hearing from her.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Zul, for this introduction, very generous introduction. And thank you, Shruti, for this invitation. One of the things one of the developments in political theory and philosophy, there's some difference, but for now I'll group them together. In the last few years has been a growing interest in ideas from other traditions. And there are multiple reasons for this interest, and we can go into them. But I think one important reason that we should consider is also that in fact, what I'm going to call academic philosophy, academic political theory, is in dire need of rejuvenation, right? There's a way in which certain debates have reached some kind of stalemate. And one of the recognitions, one of the ways in which that stalemate can be surmounted is by engaging with ideas and resources from other traditions of thought. There's also, of course, at an ideological level, and Shruti and I were talking about this just before the session started, there's been a sense, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, that we're living in a world where the ideological space has shrunk in some ways. So with the end of the fall of the Soviet Union, the idea that we're entering this space where liberal ideas have, in a sense, won, and liberal ideas are the only ideas really that are worth engaging with. That's a framing that has seen a real battering in recent years, in particular. Now, that battering is not. I'm not suggesting that liberal ideas need to be need to be given up, but I think that at the very least we can recognize that a real and serious critical engagement with the limits of liberal theorizing that is beginning to define the intellectual horizons of conversations, philosophical and theoretical conversations, really needs to be undertaken. And one strand of resources that can be brought to this conversation are ideas from other traditions and other traditions that can help us think about alternatives, right? So it is with that spirit and within that context that I engage with Islamic thought, and I think that similar questions, similar kinds of engagement can be brought to, say, indigenous Native American thought, to traditions from various multiple spaces and groups. The advantage of Islamic thought, in a sense, is that it's in some ways it is a relatively accessible tradition of thought, and it's a very alive and vibrant tradition of thought, in the sense that there are many people who continue to engage with it in multiple ways, and I'll talk about some of those ways. And it is accessible in the sense that it is also a textual tradition, which means that there are particular texts that one can pick up and debate with. Elsewhere in my work, I've actually argued that to really engage with traditions of thought beyond a kind of a Eurocentric European framework, we do also need to expand the methodological repertoire. We do need to think about other ways of engaging with ideas, whether that is through oral histories, whether that's through ethnographic immersions, whether that's through engagement with artistic production, etc. Other ways in which ideas and philosophical and generalizable ideas have been expressed in other traditions need to be engaged with and thought about very seriously. But if we think about Islamic tradition as a tradition that has multiple strands, there is really, I think, no value in thinking about it as a tradition that gives us one answer, right? There are multiple strands within Islamic thought. There are multiple competing trends within Islamic thought. But we can think about it as a tradition that is brought together by a focus on a few key texts, primarily the Quran, but also within a kind of a wider discursive framework. We can think about it as a vocabulary, right? There are certain terms, there are certain ideas that keep coming up within that tradition. And to that extent, it is a tradition despite the diversity within it. So I guess one way to think about this is that if we say, European tradition, within the European tradition, we have multiple strands. We have liberal theorizing. Within liberal theory, we have multiple strands. We have Marxist thought. We have, contemporary critical theory, etc. So there are multiple strands within European theory. They share some similarities. They critique each other, and that criticism is actually a source of strength. Now, it is a source of strength because it means that there are questions that are still being debated and engaged with by people. In the case of many other traditions of thought, that diversity was often seen as a problem, as part of the colonial epistemic rupture, but also a colonial framing of different traditions of knowledge. This was taken as a problem. So if within the Islamic context, for instance, there are multiple strands of schools of jurisprudence, there are huge differences in how the same situation will be analyzed and assessed. That was then seen as and presented as a problem, both for its practical application and for, say, legislative purposes, etc. But we can step out of that colonial framing, and we can recognize that this diversity is actually a strength. That this diversity, this vibrancy, this ongoing debate, the fact that there are questions that are still open for questioning and interpretation, that actually speaks of the dynamicism, right? So a tradition that has no questions to answer, no debates anymore, is a dead tradition. And that is much more problematic than having a tradition where there's a lot of debate and discussion and disagreement. So uh, so I think that within that context, it's also, let me also put out there another, in terms of my own research, I focus on modern Islamic thought. Now it's an area that has received much attention, particularly in the last 3 or 4 decades. But still, we see that when you look at Islamic thought, the dominant period that has been studied is medieval Islamic thought. And there's a sense that there is something pristine about that period. That is true Islamic thought. And what happens in the modern period is no longer true. It is no longer authentic. There's also this framing of modern Islamic thought as well as, Islamic thought or political theory or political thought from different parts of the world as being inauthentic and derivative, because there is an engagement with European categories of thought. So it is no longer authentic and pristine. Um, I actually think that it's again a false problem. It doesn't really, this is a framing that actually forces Islamic thought to be studied in a particular, forces us to study Islamic thought in a particular way. So it forces us to constantly be assessing, and this is what a lot of scholarship has done, is to be assessing Islamic thought by the criteria and standards of European and increasingly liberal thought, right? So we assess whether Islamic thought, how far does Islamic thought fall within, and what are the similarities with liberal theories, liberal categories, liberal frames. And there's been a lot of scholarship on that. In contrast, I've actually tried to look at the differences not to just for the sake of looking at differences, but really differences to understand and think about alternatives to the dominant intellectual framework that is liberal theorizing, to think about, what are some of the shortcomings of liberal theorizing. Because when you set up liberal theory as the standard from which Islamic thought or Indian thought or African thought or Native American thought will be judged, then you don't open liberal thought itself up for questioning and analysis and criticism. So, so I think that this question of the authenticity and lack of, true native vernacular uh, um, purity is actually, it's not an important problem, question at all. First of all, because again, if we think about, where do we have pristine thought? What does pristine thought look like? What does a pristine tradition look like? So European tradition, for instance, we know includes and has absorbed ideas from many different contexts. For instance, to take one example, which is a relatively easy example to take, is that much European theorizing, say on the question of democracy, looks back to Aristotle. But Aristotle and the Greek works were not available in European universities, in European libraries for several centuries, and they only become available through the translations and the not just the translations, but actually the elaborations, the philosophical expansion that Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars undertook within the larger kind of Islamic empire that had extended into large parts of Southern Europe, large parts of Europe, North Africa, Middle East, etc. at that time. So Aristotle is actually shared between the Islamic, and Aristotle was also then, Aristotle's influence within Islamic tradition is quite immense as well. So Aristotle is shared between the European tradition and between the Islamic tradition. And how and why is it useful to necessarily parse him out and to think about a much more kind of a pristine version of any tradition? But even more so, I think in the modern context, when we think about any tradition of thought, actually or these kind of traditions of thought from what one might call the global South, from extra Europe or beyond Europe and North America, uh, we see that actually there is much more creativity, in a sense, by these non-European traditions of thought, because they actually take ideas from European theory or European philosophy and European history, as well as their own traditions, work them together, and often come up with, very creative new ideas, new concepts. Meanwhile, if we're thinking, I'm thinking, for instance, of 1850s onwards, we can go back to, but the period that I've studied more closely is 1850 onwards, and in the South Asian context, and different thinkers, Hindu, Muslim, and from within the South Asian context, actually took on European ideas in different ways. Some competed, some contested them, some accepted some strands, contested other strands, other ideas, other concepts, but they brought those European ideas in conversation with their existing knowledge, existing traditions of thought. Meanwhile, European thinkers were not doing this, right? European thinkers had stopped engaging with traditions from other contexts, stopped engaging with ideas in that kind of detailed manner. There is an earlier version of Orientalist scholarship, where, for instance, we know for the Indian context, there was great fascination with, say, Sanskrit as this language, which was seen to be a language that tied together the Indo-Germanic, Indo or Indian or Indo-European societies together, etc. But there was a difference in how those traditions were approached at that time, because they were not approached in a way that was entirely curious in terms of what we can learn from these other traditions, right? So what I think has happened in recent years is that there's a new openness to thinking about what can we learn from these other traditions of thought, what can we learn from Native American thought, what can we learn from Hindu thought, from Muslim thought, etc., etc. And that, I think, is an interesting development. And it has its problems that we can come to when we talk about this in more detail. I mean, in the questions, if people are interested. But just the larger point that I wanted to make was, first of all, that I don't really see the value of placing a premium on some kind of pristine, authentic thought. And in fact, when we think about modern Islamic thought, I think that, as with many other traditions from the global South, modern Islamic thought is actually very creative, precisely because there's actually an engagement across traditions that many Islamic thinkers undertook. Now, South Asian Islamic thought, and this is not a nativist point, I think, but I think South Asian Islamic thought is particularly creative. It's particularly creative for a few different reasons. One is that South Asian Islamic thought actually moves. So, Euro-American academia has seen the Middle East as the locus of Islamic thought. For a very long time, Islamic thought is seen to be the kind of preserve of the Middle East. And if you wanted to study Islamic thought, you basically had to look at what various thinkers in the Middle East had suggested and proposed. I think that South Asian Islamic thought has been, and practice has been, particularly innovative over the last 200 years. And there's now growing realization of that. It's been particularly innovative in terms of schools of thought, new schools of thought, the Deoband school of thought. It's been particularly innovative in terms of new organizational structures, such as the Tablighi Jamaat, which is a transnational, one of the biggest, in a sense, organized grouping of Muslims. But it's also been particularly innovative in taking ideas. For instance, the Islamic socialism has been thought through and elaborated in a lot of detail by South Asian and Southeast Asian thinkers. And so this kind of bringing together of multiple traditions has happened within the South Asian context and is relatively under-recognized. So why is South Asian thought why has it been quite so innovative? I think one reason is that in the South Asian context, which is an immensely religiously diverse context, right? So often in my classes, I use a map to show that when we say Europe is a continent and South Asia is a subcontinent, by South Asia, we often mean, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. So South Asia is called a subcontinent and Europe is called a continent. Actually, in terms of physical space as well as number of people, we know population, as well as the ethnic, linguistic, religious diversity, South Asia is much bigger than what we traditionally call Europe, right? The Western European subcontinent of Asia. Because if you look at a map, uh, Europe is a subcontinent. It's not this way. We still call it a continent often in various conversations, but if you look at a map, it's actually a part of Asia that is not entirely clearly separated. A continent is a separate landmass. Africa is a continent. Australia is a continent, and Europe is not a continent in that sense. And in fact, this is part of colonial hubris, colonial framing of knowledge more generally, that the so-called scientific geographical way that Asia, South Asia, which is actually physically bigger, is called a subcontinent. And so it's in this space of immense religious and linguistic diversity that Islamic thought and practice was really deeply entrenched in a context that was beyond Abrahamic faiths. Whereas in the Middle Eastern context, Abrahamic faiths, Jewish, Christianity, Judaism, Christianity, Islam were dominant. In the South Asian context, there's much more non-Abrahamic presence, and it requires a rethinking, reworking of some deeply held ideas and practices. But also, it's a place where Arabic, Persianate, Sanskrit, and many other vernacular languages, the ideas, literatures, civilizational practices, etc., came together. And the innovation and creativity started much earlier, but actually we see some of the fruition of that, some of the manifestations of that from about 200, 250 years ago. So I think in that sense, the South Asian context has been particularly interesting, and South Asian Islamic thought and practice has been very, very creative and important and interesting for us to engage with. So we can think about any tradition of thought, both in terms of what I think of as a methodology, right? How knowledge is ontological and epistemological questions about knowledge, who produces knowledge, how do we recognize knowledge, what does knowledge look like, etc. And also, of course, the substantive debates and whether that they're about justice or what does a good life look like, or tolerance. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the specific contribution in terms of tolerance here. Now, as I said, South Asia is a particularly religiously diverse context, right? There's multiple religious communities. And in fact, when we say even if I say something very broad like Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Parsi, Jewish, Sikh, etc., Jain, Buddhist, actually, even these categories are reifying multiple strands within each. So within Hinduism, within Islam, within Sikhism, within Jainism, there's just multiple strands, multiple variations, such that often, one could say that South Asia is a subcontinent group didn't recognize, one group of Muslims didn't recognize the others as necessarily Muslim, or one group, we know, for instance, in the case of Dalits, that for until the late 19th century, they were not recognized as Hindus, right? So caste Hindus were Hindus and Dalits were not Hindus. And there were other compulsions, including electoral democracy and the compulsion of building a majority, that led to a recognition of Dalits, or a reframing of Dalits as Hindus. So there are, but this is just to say that there were multiple traditions, multiple ways of being part of any particular religious tradition. And then if you look at that, you realize that compared to South Asia, the European context was the much more homogenized, and actually, even if sociologically at the same time, right? So actually, since the Reformation, for instance, we see an increasing homogenization of European normative value is for homogeneity. And tolerance emerges as a very limited acceptance of some form of difference. This is, I'm assuming many of you know that history about the history of wars of religions in the European context. It's a very specific history. And it is a very specific history that is not shared by other parts of the world, certainly in the South Asian context. At the same time, in our history, in the history of that region, you didn't actually have that kind of erasure of difference. There were sometimes spectacular wars between different religious groups. Often religious identity was not the key marker. So for a long time, we know from scholarship that, the difference between Muslims and Hindus was actually not significant. The difference that was significant was Turks and non-Turks. For instance, there were other forms of differentiation that were important. So for a region that is as diverse as this, right, so we can flip and ask, why isn't there more violence if diversity will inevitably lead to violence in this region, where there is this immense diversity? And why does the discourse of tolerance arise in Europe, where actually sociologically there is very little variation, there's very little diversity? And we see, especially after the Inquisitions, the wars of religion, and then the rise of colonialism, that difference becomes increasingly a problem. So it is no coincidence that nationalism, the idea that there is a nation which is somewhat homogenized, which is, people who share a culture, a language, etc., arises in the same context as democratic ideas, or idea of democracy arises, right? Um, and what that means is that actually nationalism is deeply embedded in ideas of liberal democracy. The idea that ideally a liberal democracy will produce a homogeneous body of citizens. There's a valorization of homogeneity in a way that is missing, is absent in the South Asian context. So often the question that is asked is, why is there no discourse of tolerance in South Asian traditions, or why in Islamic thought, why isn't there, why there's no equivalent of tolerance, there's no one word that one can use that. And I think with that, we're asking the wrong question. The question is not why, the question is often presented as if there's a lack. Why didn't Islamic thought, or South Asian Islamic thought, or South Asian thought produce the idea of tolerance? Well, because they didn't need to, because there was no valorization of homogenization in the same way as what happened in the European context. Um, so there's a very the tolerance that then emerged in the European context. So actually, how am I doing for time?
Well, you've just gone over 25 minutes, so but you were at a good
Okay.
point, so I didn't want to interrupt. So please,
All
it's really
right.
up to you.
Yeah.
So
All right. Thank you. Yeah. No, I just wanted to have a rough idea so that I can hear people's questions, which is the more interesting part for me. Okay, so to go back to the idea of that very historically specific vision of tolerance, and yet what has happened is that that liberal conception of tolerance, and I'll go into the specificities of that, that liberal conception of tolerance has, in a sense, colonized the idea of tolerance, right? So it's quite common now to say, X is very liberal, they're very tolerant, or this idea that to be liberal is to be tolerant is to be liberal. There's this conflation of the two, which is really a product of post-war liberal theory, post-Second World War liberal theory. And again, there are specific historical junctures and reasons perhaps that led to this conflation. But um, we can think of other visions of tolerance. So liberal conceptions of tolerance rely upon the idea of individual freedom of conscience. It's a highly legalized concept. It's a highly individualized concept, and it is depending upon the idea of the freedom of conscience. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't have freedom of conscience, right? This is to say that this particular vision comes with some limitations. It comes with some problems because it arose in a specific context. It arose to address a particular problem. It doesn't necessarily travel very well onto other contexts. Meanwhile, the other vision of tolerance that I've elaborated in the paper that I recommended as kind of a resource for you, but you don't have to read this. I mean, I can just kind of talk about it very quickly. There's another vision of tolerance that doesn't necessarily rely upon that individual freedom, legalized conception of individual freedom of conscience. It relies, if at all there is an individual at value that it cherishes, that's humility, right? It's epistemic humility, the idea that we may not know enough to be able to judge the other completely and fully, and so one parks judgment, and in a sense gives up judgment if that is to lead to particularly juridical results. And at the same time, this is inspired by, and this is linked to the long-running history of Sharia as a self-imposed mechanism, right? So for most of Islamic history, Sharia has not been imposed by the state. Sharia is a way of life. And Sharia is not really a set of rules either. Often it is translated as such, but Sharia is really a broad set of principles from which that are interpreted for specific situations. For most of Islamic history, Sharia has not been imposed by the state, even though at various historical junctures, various rulers would say that we are here to further the cause of Sharia, etc. But partly because the institutional mechanism for that kind of imposition did not exist, and but it's a chicken and egg situation. But that institutional mechanism was not developed because it was seen largely as a means for self-imposition of certain principles. Actually, even today, the ways in which Sharia is practiced is community-based and mostly individually imposed. So, for instance, you can go to Mufti, somebody who can give a learned opinion, and you can ask about how to divide some inheritance that you have. And the Mufti gives their scholarly opinion on that based on precedents, based on the school of jurisprudence they belong to. They can't enforce it on you, right? So the Mufti can only give you an opinion, and you are entirely free, in theory at least, to go to a different Mufti. And people do that, right? And some Muftis, a friend of mine carried out some research in Britain with some Sharia courts here, and the Muftis complain that people go fatwa shopping, that they go from Mufti to Mufti to get the ruling that they are actually looking for, that they want to follow. But this is not to say that there is no force of imposition. There is often community force of imposition, right? So, but it's not necessarily state imposed, and there's a big difference there. Whereas with liberal tolerance, we are looking for state imposition, for legal structures that allow that liberal tolerance to be facilitated in particular contexts. So I think that, I mean, there are several aspects to this debate that I'm happy to open up in questions, but I think that the South Asian context is particularly fruitful space and context for us to think about tolerance that require state management, that does not require extensive legal framings. It is complicated now by the fact that actually states do exist. Modern states do have very highly sophisticated, highly intrusive uh, structures of legal imposition at their disposal. But I think the kinds of resources that the various spaces of multi-religious, multi-ethnic coexistence, tolerance that is not predicated on the idea of legal individual freedom of conscience, etc., because it is part of the living practice of South Asian context, even now, despite the many challenges that it has faced in recent years because of rising, religious nationalism of various kinds, because of various other pressures. Nevertheless, there is still a living, thriving tradition of multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual communities living together and being able to kind of work together, that actually there is much to learn and draw out from their experiences, and to kind of engage with how they do it, which is often very different from, as I said, from liberal visions of tolerance. Okay, so I'll stop here and I'll take any questions and comments at this point.
Right. Thank you so much, Humaira, for your talk. And now is the part of the session where we open the floor for questions. So if there are any questions, just unmute yourself, and maybe I would recommend showing yourself as well, just so that we can see who we are talking to. And please, Vin, do you have something to say?
Yes, I do have something to
Yes.
say. Sorry, let me just read this and make sure I can formulate my words in a coherent sentence before I project it to you. Firstly, thank you for your talk. I learned quite a lot today. It was very interesting, especially like the Dalit thing, how Dalits were always considered to be Hindus. New stuff. Today I learned. So anyway, what was my question was a thing about religion, I suppose. And is religion a Western category, do you think? And do you think, I think there's also an opinion quite prevalent in certain circles that say that using the term religion as opposed to a non-Western term for it kind of betokens a kind of ethnocentrism. In other words, we think of religion in the way that the West, whatever the West is, thinks of religion, and that prevents us from seeing the world or seeing the thing that is in other cultures known as, I don't know, Dharm, Agama, whatever word they use for religion. Deen, I guess, is an Arabic word. So yes, well, I was wondering what your thoughts on the category religion is.
Okay, thank you. That's a very useful question. And it's a question that keeps coming up in different ways as soon as we travel elsewhere out of the European context for thinking about political ideas and political resources. Because one of the things that obviously happens within the European context is that politics becomes defined through its negation of religion, through its opposition with religion, right? So these are, in a sense, deeply related terms, but we recognize what is politics by saying this is religion, this is not politics, and this is politics, it is not religion. So to that extent, a very specific definition of religion is certainly a Western construct. It is, I think, not so much a question of terminology. So to call it dharma, to call it deen, is not so much that there is a different term, but actually there's a whole constellation of ideas behind that term that that term allows us to think about. So for instance, with the term deen, what we get is this idea that politics is not outside of the deen, right? I was listening to one of the other speakers that you had for this term's seminars. I think he might have been, so that is that Professor Patel maybe, and he was talking about Sanskrit sources, and again the difference, the difficulty in thinking about religion in this context, and the fact that many of these philosophical texts do not necessarily separate out ethics from their other kind of philosophical conversations. And I think that that's a very prevalent trend. I mean, we see that also within the Islamic context, that the kinds of separations that we are used to seeing within philosophical texts in the European context do not exist, because those separations do not entirely make sense, right? So you will have these texts that will talk about metaphysics, but then very quickly also talk about what to wear on particular occasions, talk about, very abstract notions of justice, and then talk about very particular ways of addressing a particular type of complainant, or a person asking for justice. And so in some ways, it's a very different way of parsing out that relationship between the metaphysical and the physical, the material and the transcendent. So I guess this is a long answer to your relatively sharp and focused question, to say that I think that there is a real problem with the substantive category, so the substantive material that is contained within the category religion. And I do actually find Talal Asad, who's a postcolonial theorist and anthropologist, I do find his critique of religion, the category of religion, quite convincing, because his critique of religion is to say that what it leads us towards is to think about a very definite structure of what goes into that category, and that very definite substantive contour, those very definite substantive contours rely so heavily on the European context that we are constantly force-fitting other traditions, other ideas to fit into that category, and they keep slipping out and they don't entirely make sense. Actually, the category religion doesn't make full sense even within the European context, right? Even within the European context, we have to reify various ideas. We have to abstract out of various kinds of lived practices to make sense of this category. So I think, it's the category is problematic. The question is not so much of terminology. The question is much more of the substantive aspects of this category and how it has been used to define politics. It's in the European context, it's a very important way of trying to demarcate what is politics and what is not. But happy to, you're looking a bit confused, so.
I just have one more question, really short, yes or no question, and then I can pass it on to the next person because I don't want to take too much time. So more often than not, yes or no, do you think religion is a useful category for you to use?
No.
Okay.
And yet I use it because no, because you have to try and speak to an audience to make sense of, even to make sense of your arguments. You have to use the category that you are negating, right? I have to keep saying tolerance. In my previous conversation, I spoke about tolerance. only to help you think about other modes of being that we can also think of as tolerance, but which are different from the tolerance that that is the dominant norm of tolerance. So some of these terms we don't escape entirely, we can't escape entirely, and yet it is part of the critical project, any critical project, to open up the way we use that term, right? So I can't invent a new term and say, well, from today, I will not use the term religion, and anybody who wants to talk to me about religion will have to actually talk about X, right? Because intellectual and political engagement has to be a social, communal activity. You have to work with the terms that exist, and yet, of course, recognize the limitations that they bring with them. So that's yes, but a very long answer with that yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Vin, for that question, and thank you for answering that, Humaira. So we have another question. It's actually in the chat box. It's from Yesh. Please correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrongly. And Yesh asks, specifically talking from about India with respect to the rising religious ethno-nationalism in politics and what Mirananda would call reactionary modernity, can we afford to criticize the idea of liberal cosmopolitanism or individualism, etc., or say having a postmodern attitude without first having proper modernity, which sociologist Dipankara Gupta would call mistaken modernity, and knowing that these liberal secular ideas are coming under attack from far-right parties or movements as well. So I think there's like two parts to this question, unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, well, it's a very useful question. And I think it's a very important question that needs to be asked every time we turn towards a religious tradition. And there's the word religion again, a religious tradition for thinking about alternatives, because, very easily one could slip into a kind of nativism, a kind of nationalism, religious nationalism. And so one part of your question is to say, um, well, I guess let me actually start with the issue of whether we can afford to, at this point, let go of liberal legal frameworks. And I think that we can't. And so the suggestion is not that we let go of them entirely right now, but the suggestion is to understand their limits and to work with alternative ideas and experiment with them, right? So what would it mean, say, in the context of Hindutva in India right now? How would we challenge Hindutva if we are to if we let go of the language of individual legal rights? In fact, we see that individual legal rights in particular don't do very much for the communities, the groups that are under persecution right now, whether that is Dalits, whether that is Muslims. As such, individual legal rights have not necessarily provided them with much protection. And also, to mobilize against Hindutva at this point, the idea of individual legal rights is not necessarily what is really holding Hindutva back. It is actually much more communal, cross-communal solidarities which are actually holding the fort and which are really raising the challenge for Hindutva at this point. The other, part of this, or a kind of, I guess, a related part of this is to think, okay, is it that the idea of secularism or the concept of secularism is needed to actually combat religious nationalism of the kind that BJP is practicing in India right now? And I think that this is a harder question in some ways. It's harder because on the one hand, secularism immediately brings to the fore again a certain constellation of ideas that allows us to think about moving beyond religious identities, moving towards a kind of a larger goal that is not defined by our religious identities, and there's much that is very attractive in secularism. I have a critique of the concept of secularism um, that, I mean, for practical purposes, I think what has also happened within many contexts, including India, is that activists who proposed and who supported secularism, this is not a critique of the concept of secularism. I mean, I've parked that for now. It's a critique of how secular politics have played out, is that many of these activists looked towards the state, towards legal frameworks to deliver the job of tolerance or communal harmony, etc. Whereas Hindutva activists look towards society, engaged with groups and individuals in mohalla by mohalla, carried out that work of painstaking and often, not very glamorous work of working in certain localities, and built up over the long term, built up a support for certain kinds of ideas, normalizing those ideas. This is not to say, and this is not at all to denigrate the work that many committed activists on the other side opposing Hindutva have also undertaken. But I think there was something seductive in the idea of secularism as state separation, state mandated separation of religion and politics, or or rather, as Salala suggests, it's really state management of religion, right? We don't actually ever have a separation. What we have is the state manages religious thought and practice. There's something seductive about leaving a lot to the state there, which is actually then makes it quite hard to combat the kind of mobilizational strategies and activities that Hindutva groups carried out. So I think, so there's that part. And I think that the other part of what you're asking about is that I think that we can emphasize how Hindutva is different from Hinduism. And that's a strategy that many people, many activists have undertaken to separate out. And that is a strategy that doesn't really require secularism per se. I mean, one can be a secularist and undertake that strategy as well, but it doesn't necessarily depend upon either liberal individual rights or the idea of secularism to change the discourse within the Indian context to say Hindutva is not Hinduism. To be a Hindu, to be a good Hindu, does not have to entail all of this other stuff that Hindutva has brought with it. And so I think that is one other way of thinking about what kinds of strategies we can see and bring to the fore that are perhaps more vernacular in a sense, right? Because there are other ways of being Hindu. There are multiple ways of, I mean, a cliched example is how Sufi shrines are spaces where different religious traditions come together and build a kind of a solidarity, etc. But those kinds of shared spaces, etc., have a very entrenched history in the South Asian context. And so what can we bring out from those practices to combat the ideational and political strategies of Hindutva?
I also think that maybe there's something to be said about, the failures of, trying to adapt European liberal ideas into an Indian context that was very prevalent in, the post-colonial imagination, and how true, how much can you argue that today Hindutva and religious fundamentalism is actually, in response to the failures of these liberal ideas that don't necessarily, address issues within the South Asian or even the Indian context. I think in relation to that, actually, I have a few just comments, questions that I would love to hear your thoughts on. Is one of those things is that last time when we were doing our discussion groups on Africana philosophy, one of the things that Jane Anna Gordon talked about was the idea of creolization, and how and creolization as sort of blending, that is really a word that comes up in that literature, but really it's this idea of unconscious, unintentional blending of language, culture, ideas in certain contexts, in certain colonial contexts, but even in post-colonial contexts. And I thought that was really interesting term, because when you were talking about, you know, the sort of flourishing and the engagement with both these European ways of thinking, as well as all of these other sort of ideas that still, like, you know, were flourishing, you know, that, you know, can be considered Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, whatever. But yeah, so that was one thing. And the other thing was from the article, and, you know, one of the ways that you sum up what, like, you know, Gandhi's, like, you know, sort of political ideas, which I just thought was beautiful, was you talk about tolerant, like, you know, or he talks about tolerance as a duty and not a right. And I was just wondering if you could talk about that a bit and what that means.
Yeah, thank you. These are really very helpful comments. So on the question of creolization, yeah, I think that, you know, this is an important concept, and it works very well in particular contexts. So I guess I'm still trying to think about how it would travel to the South Asian context, partly because the history of you know, with any term, as I've said before, with any term you have a association of other ideas and values. So in the South Asian context, creolization brings with it a certain idea of racial intermixing as well, which is quite productive and but also quite specific to the Caribbean and South America. So maybe I haven't understood your comment properly, but are you asking whether that idea can, in a sense, speak to the diversity and the ways in which South Asian diversity has happened in the past?
Well, I guess I mean it in, like, you know, an intellectual way. So, like, I think, like, the way Gordon thinks about it, she's like, you know, she talks about creolizing Rosa Luxemburg and how Rosa Luxemburg's, like, philosophies on socialism was received. And also, but, like, you know, also like her own writings on slavery, and how she understood these Caribbean contexts as a socialist and through her political philosophies. So in a way, like, you know, what it really is about mixing of ideas and, like, you know, borrowing from different schools of thought, which might not always be self-conscious or intentional, but they just, like, you know, happen to be, like, you know, in, I guess, like, the fluid culture that we live in. But yeah.
Right. Actually, yeah, so okay, that helps. Thank you. And that is very useful, because I think that also helps us get beyond this idea of derivative discourses, or, you know, inauthentic discourses. Because one of the ways in which, I guess, you know, one of the questions that this answers is that people have said, oh, well, okay, they were, say, Indian Marxists, but effectively Marxism is a European idea, right? And the response to that is that actually not really. So yes, a version of it is articulated in the European context by Marx, but the way it is expanded, the way Marxism takes on a very different life, the way the concept of equality is expanded, the concept of freedom is expanded by, say, Indian or Caribbean or African activists and thinkers, it actually really takes Marxist thought beyond that initial European context. And, you know, the other important question is, what is the premium on origin? So the fact that it came from a particular context does not by itself just make it European. What it does tell us that it arose in a particular context. There were certain historical, intellectual frameworks and environment within that which that idea arose, or those sets of ideas arose, but it doesn't actually make that idea belong to that group or to that person, in the same way as Islamic ideas are open for anybody to engage with, and they're not just for Muslims. They don't necessarily have to be only available and important and useful for Muslims. They're available for anybody. Native American ideas, if we approach them with curiosity and humility, they are as available to us as to anybody else. If we are willing to kind of think with them sympathetically and empathetically as well as critically, then they are as available to us as to anybody else. So So I think that premium on origin certainly needs to be displaced. And to that extent, that idea of creolization is very, very useful. The other part about thinking about tolerance as a duty, this I think is interesting to think about, partly because it places the idea of tolerance against the idea of tolerance as a duty, against the idea of tolerance as a right. And this is not just important within Islamic thought, where many many rights that are seen as rights are actually seen as obligations on individuals. But it's an important idea also in other traditions, other South Asian traditions. So, for instance, Gandhi had a similar kind of a view about rights, right? So he said, if everybody has rights, who will give to whom? And for Gandhi as well, the idea of obligation was very important. The idea that it is the individual's obligation to undertake certain transformations in herself, to be able to contribute to society in particular ways. This is an idea that is quite prevalent in across traditions, I think, certainly in the South Asian context. But it has a particular genealogy in the Islamic tradition that I've drawn upon here, because Ghamdi, the person that I'm writing about, is also drawing explicitly from the Islamic tradition to be able to make this argument. It's a complicated argument in the sense that rights are important legal instruments in the contemporary context, right? So the argument is not that we write off rights or that we give up on rights. The arguments, again, as with other things, is to think about what is the limit of rights and how can we move beyond focus only on rights, because sometimes a focus on rights is actually counterproductive. It doesn't actually lead to greater equality. It doesn't actually lead to greater freedom. So what are those situations? Be much more specific about the context in which rights may not necessarily be as productive as we either have been led to believe or as we would like them to be.
Thank you, Humeira. And on that last note, I completely agree. I mean, given in our current circumstances, a focus on rights is not really has not really been helpful. If everyone is demanding their right to go out and have the freedoms or for a reopening of the pubs, then I cannot imagine much worse situation than that. And sometimes it's about collective good rather than what you want. And actually, Yash has like another question, and he says, or she says, or actually I'm not too sure. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So Hinduism is different from Hindutva is the type of argument which Shashi Tharoor promoted, but it came under severe criticism from Kancha Ilaya and Jyotirmaya Sharma, that it's a very soft approach, and he would like, or they would like comments if you have any for that.
Sure, yes. So I think I know that Shashi Tharoor's work came under that form of that criticism, and Jyotirmaya Sharma in particular is a very thoughtful critic of Hindutva. So I think that there's a danger in picking up on one person as exemplifying that how that strategy might be practiced. Shashi Tharoor's intervention was a very particular one. It came with its limitations also because of how he made that argument and which audiences he made that argument for. And it wasn't linked to a movement as such. It wasn't linked to it was a very individualistic form of an argument, wasn't linked to any mobilization, wider mobilization. And so some of the criticism that Shashi Tharoor faced was partly because of that, because of anyway, so some of the criticism he faced is quite particular to him. And I think that it is actually it's a fair criticism that this is an approach that has some important limits, that you still kind of remain framed within a wider Hindu conversation, for instance. This is the kind of criticism, for instance, that Gandhi faced from Ambedkar when Ambedkar made the argument that Gandhi was on the question of Dalits, Gandhi's term of Harijan was patronizing. Gandhi was using, Hindu ideas and Vedic principles to justify a somewhat paternalistic attitude towards the untouchables, or what the groups that were called untouchables at that time. And there is some force to that argument that excessive reliance on a particular religious terminology can be problematic. And so my suggestion here is to actually draw upon that, but draw upon it in way. I mean, there can be more creative ways of doing this, and there can be more communal ways of doing this. By communal, I mean not as in separate communities, but communal as in collective ways of doing this, building a collective discourse that actually draws upon vernacular, popular ideas, and yet also reworks them. This is the kind of creative rethinking and reworking that actually has happened and continues to be undertaken to combat for instance, in this case, Hindutva. But I think that, the larger principle of recognizing that the the alternative of individual legal rights has not necessarily helped either, should certainly spur us to thinking about this in much more creative ways than we have done in the past, and to continue to spur us to bring together mobilizational strategies and communities that we may not have looked at in the past.
Okay, thank you, Mara. And actually, I have a question of my own. So, and I would like to go back to this unique phenomenon or position of South Asia, and South Asia thinkers in particular. I was wondering, is there really something, special about South Asia that we are not getting? Because it seems, at least from my really amateur observations, that South Asian traditions, regardless of Islamic, Buddhist, or Hindu, have always had this um, capacity or propensity to be rather tolerant of differing ideas, and in some instances even reaching to the point of some form of like syncretism, that have resulted in the formation of new traditions on their own, of their own. And is this can this and my point is that is there a particular kind of cultural lens in South Asia that is being utilized when reading, for instance, Gamidi, when he reads Islamic texts, or he reads the Islamic corpus, the Quran or the Hadith, and the ways by which he engages the text. Can we say, that there is a kind of cultural viewing or cultural interpretation, even, if you will, that's at play here? Because it cannot be denied that throughout the history of religions within the South Asian continent, there certainly has been these sorts of moves taking place. And I'm just really wondering about that, and I'm really fascinated, and I was wondering if you could share some comments on that, if you will.
Sure, thank you. So that's an important question, and I guess in some ways I will not have a satisfactory answer um, in terms of the cultural lens that you're asking about.
Right.
I'm just not qualified to answer that, but I think that, and I guess I'm thinking of culture in a very specific way, but actually just to say ground Gandhi and other thinkers that I've looked at, it is, of course, just the lived experience. So rather than thinking of culture, I'm thinking much more of the
Right.
lived experience of that diversity, the
Mm-hmm.
experience of having to negotiate and engage with that diversity on an everyday basis. That is very much forms the hinterlands for many of these thinkers.
Right.
So this is yeah, I'm not sure if this is a specifically cultural framing, but it's to my mind, it's just much more of a social and
Right.
lived experience where there is just that amount of diversity that, many of these thinkers have lived with, have experienced. Actually, to that extent, of course, the change after partition is that Pakistan is much more homogenous.
Mm.
So India remains much more diverse, but Pakistan, as a predominantly Muslim country, is quite homogenous. And yet, of course, that homogeneity is broken up in different ways. There are multiple ways of being Muslims. There are different ethnic groups. There are different linguistic groups. And in any society, there are different classes. But certainly that linguistic and ethnic diversity is very much a feature of lived experience in the Pakistani context. In India, much more so, because India does retain much more of its religious diversity. One of the things that, this, your question, and actually Sruti's question also raises, is the one other way of thinking about the limitations of liberal democracies to address these problems is to all, if we recognize that some of these problems are raised by liberal democracies. How?
Mm.
So the first thing is that, liberal democracies actually really support the framing of populations as majorities and minorities. And in the South Asian context, so that the Kaviraj has written about it, others have written about the fact that groups and individuals and communities that had not thought of themselves as belonging to a majority or a minority then began to gravitate towards this, right? So, as I said, Dalits were not even considered Hindu. And then as electoral pressures mounted up, it became quite clear to various groups, including the Congress, and Cassie Adcock has written about this, that it became partly for electoral pressures to make the Hindu majority, to make a majority out of Hindu, the category, Dalits had to be included into that category, Hindu. Had Dalits, and one of the things that Ambedkar was arguing for was a separate electorate for, and other Dalit leaders, a separate electorate for Dalits, and Dalits not to be recognized, not to be subsumed within the category Hindu. So one of the ways in which liberal democracies actually foster politicization and some amount of competition within communities is by requiring the making of majorities and minorities. And the other way that liberal democracies do that is that, as I mentioned, liberal democracies, the idea of democracy, and within, particularly in liberal thought, is very closely tied to the idea of the nation. And we have contemporary liberal theorists as well who argue that the nation is important for democracy, some version of an idea of the nation where you are willing to give up something today for members of the nation tomorrow, or something today to subsidize members of the nation living in, northern Britain, for instance. uh, some vision of the nation is important for liberal democracy to operate, but that vision of the nation then also brings with it nationalism, which is deeply kind of imbricated with ideas of homogenizing, creating a nation that is very similar. So these competing pressures of homogenizing and building a majority have, in a sense, this is what Hindutva is about. Hindutva
Yeah.
is about, so Hindutva is not against democracy in that sense, in the kind of reductive electoral sense. Hindutva is very much about utilizing democracy, democratic electoral procedures to build a certain kind of majority, to assert that kind of majority through the claim to be a nation that will, to be a united nation, etc., that will assert that those norms. So I think that there are, when we recognize that this is linked to liberal democracy, that this is not outside of liberal democracy, this is very much linked to the fractures within liberal democracy, then we recognize the importance of thinking about alternative frames and alternative mobilizational techniques and conceptual repertoires that can allow us some recourse in this context.
All right. Thank you so much for answering that question. So actually we've reached, well, it says on my computer 6:25, so it's supposed to end at 6:30. So we have 5 more minutes.
Well,
Sorry?
sorry, I mean, I kind of had sort of a comment to,
Okay, please,
your
please.
question, and like, something that I was thinking about, in terms of, I guess, I mean, I think that like, I really agree with Humeira that I'm not sure that there's a sense of like, a certain like, culture of toleration, but I think that there are historical reasons for toleration as, political strategies. I think that like,
Right.
if we look at something in terms of like the South Asian continent, subcontinent, and we think about like, the Mughal, like, sort of invasion, and then like, empire really in South Asia, you don't see mass conversion at all. You still see like, people retaining like religious diversities, and there isn't a state imposition of any sort of religion. And I mean, there are actually periods where you see religious innovation, like I'm thinking of Akbar, that was like, something that was taught to us in India all the time, like, his real, like, he literally created a new religion that would unite like Hindus and Muslims. That's not Hinduism or Islam. And then I think also comes anti-colonial resistance, like, like 1857 mutiny, that's like, sort of like now historiographically, you're seeing a trend of like, reading that 1857 mutiny as the first war of independence in India. And that was something that was like, cross-religious, and that was something that different communities and in different parts of India participated in. And that was one of the big things that the British also noticed, that they really like, and they helped foster certain religious divisions and certain, forms of identitarian politics, to foster further division. So I think that there's something to be said there about like, really the historical context of South Asia, and like, the way maybe like a certain culture of toleration can be found. But this is not at all, I mean, I would never want to like, talk about India as some sort of, or even South Asia as some sort of like, religiously tolerant, or, foster any sort of idea of like cultural exceptionalism. Just that, certain historical contexts might have fostered political strategies that might have led to more tolerance than other places.
Yeah, well, thank you, Shruti. But two quick thoughts on that. Actually, one is that I think that we can actually think about the recent rise of intolerance, because what we see is much more recent, and the manifestations of violent, continuous, relatively continuous, religiously inspired violence. And when I say recent, I mean something that really comes to the fore in the last century. So when you're thinking historically, recent is the time frame is slightly longer, but it is relatively recent, and there. So I think that we should not be shy of thinking about it as a relatively tolerant place. We should, because there are multiple resources that are available, and what are we comparing it to? post-war Europe, right into the 70s. People of color were, it was very difficult if you wanted to find accommodation. Landlords and landladies would say, don't even bother coming in if you're not white. Restaurants would have signs separating out blacks and whites, or South Asians and whites, etc. In terms of the dominance of religious ideas, right into towards the end of the empire was actually validated, and ideational validation for it was provided by the idea of white man civilizing mission, the Christian empire. The Christianity was central to the framing of the empire. So I'm not sure what we are comparing it to when we think about South Asia as not a tolerant place, right? So I think that once we open up the question of self-representation of Europe as a tolerant society, once we open up the questions of recurrent nationalism, white supremacism in Europe today as well, then we can perhaps appreciate better some of the ongoing living with diversity, which is a feature of South Asian life to a large extent. Still, there are spectacular acts of violence so this is not to shy away. This is not a nativist argument to say, well, everything's fine and we don't need to worry about it. But I think we need to calibrate and rethink exactly how we are and who and what we are comparing it to. And on Akbar, Akbar is a very good example and is often commonly used, although it was very much about him. He was to be the center of the new religion, but it was definitely a much more definitely that.
I think that in terms of tolerance, I mean, the only thing that I would say in terms of that is that you're right, absolutely. Like, you see an enormous amount of diversity and people living with that diversity. But I think that's where it is, right? Like, I think maybe I'm sort of thinking of tolerance as something that you self-consciously do or participate in, right? You are tolerant towards others, even though you might have an understanding, like, wherever that is from, like society or like, cultural understanding of difference, and maybe even like, certain like, ideas of difference that can verge towards, supremacy or like, certain ideas of inferiority. And I guess like, in some ways you could you could argue that the certain, living with one another in these diverse spaces, you don't even really recognize the diversity. You only see the diversity when it comes from the outside looking in, and when you're actually like part of that context and growing up in like, sort of like, cities where diversity is just an everyday part of your existence, you might not be always aware that there is a difference, and that like, there should be a difference. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that that's a very like, sort of historically grounded point or anything like that. But I just think that maybe that's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's entirely valid because one of the things that the South Asian context does is that there is greater living with difference, but at the same time, we also need to recognize that there's no valorization of difference. There's no appreciation of difference in the sense. And also, one of the problems in the contemporary context that we have to really battle with is equality with difference, right? So it's not just that people live with difference, but also how do we achieve some form of equality? And so I'm not at all proposing that there are simple solutions and that we can just look towards a model and just pick up something, but that actually creative interpretive work is required of us, but that it is possible, that the resources are there and we can make better use of the resources that are there. But yes, it requires some amount of work from us.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Humeira, for this evening. Is there anyone else with a final question, possibly? This is the absolute last call. So if there is no one, then everyone please join me in thanking Humaira for spending time with us and um, illuminating or making the dark rooms of our minds a little bit brighter this evening. Thank you so much, Humaira, for your insights and your talk, and we look forward to seeing you again in with the Oxford Public Philosophy Group. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.